All right. So, what we're going to do this evening is have a look at Ezekiel 38 under this title of Russia Unleashes Armageddon. And this sort of links us back a little bit because we've been looking at Daniel chapter 11 and we said, why don't we sort of have a look at Ezekiel 38? Because those two chapters are connected. And so tonight is all about Ezekiel chapter 38. Ezekiel chapter 38 is very famous passage in scripture. There's lots and lots and lots of talks about this. So this is my take on it, having looked at it for decade upon decade upon decade. So, it's one of these talks as well that consistently updates or constantly updates because events keep moving along. So this is the latest, most up-to-date version of this talk on Ezekiel 38. So I put the words on the screen here of some of the verses. In fact, I might open up my Bible. So I've got Ezekiel 38 open. So Ezekiel chapter 38, there are 23 verses. We've got 8 of them on the screen. So I'm just going to read this little bit to you, and then we'll delve in and see what it's talking about. So verse 1 says, "The word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, set your face against Gog, of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, This is what the Lord God says, Behold, I am against you, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. And I will turn you back and put hooks into your jaws, and I will bring you forth and all your army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armor, even a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet, Gomer and all his troops, the house of Togarmah of the north quarters, and all his troops, and many people with you. Get prepared and prepare for yourself, you and all your company that are assembled unto you, and be a guard unto them. After many days you'll be visited. In the latter years you will come into the land that's brought back from the sword, and is gathered out of many people against the mountains of Israel, which have always been waste, but is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them." So clearly, this is a passage that's talking about conflict. It's talking about a lot of names that we don't recognize here. So, there's somebody called Gog, and there's places like Magog, Meshech, and Tubal, and Togarmah, and Gomer. There's a couple of places that we do maybe know, like Persia. So where would Persia be nowadays? Iran, yeah. Ethiopia, we know. Libya, we know. So there's a few places that we sort of know, but there's a whole lot of places that we don't really know. But it's talking there, of course, about a huge army that's coming down into and against the mountains of Israel. And that's why this becomes a very interesting chapter, because we believe this chapter is none other than a detailed description of Armageddon, when all nations, well, not every single nation, but many nations are gathered against Israel in this enormous war that is centered upon God's people living in the land. Now, you might wonder, because obviously Ezekiel was written something like 600 years before Jesus was born. Could he have been prophesying about something that was happening in the future, but still maybe it happened a long, long time ago? Maybe all this is history that's already happened now. But I don't think it is, for this reason. So if you have a look in verse 8, it says in verse 8, "In the latter years you will come into the land," i.e. into Israel. And in lots of other different versions of the Bible, it will say things like, "In the distant future you'll come into the land of Israel." Or some versions say, "In the last days you will come into the land of Israel." So this little phrase, "in the latter years," is really saying in the last days or in the distant future. So clearly, this is something at the time of the end. It's something that's happening just before Jesus comes back, or around about the time that Jesus comes back. The next thing to say is that this prophecy is all about really an individual human being that lives on planet Earth at the time of the end. Because if you look at it in verse 2, God says to Ezekiel, who's there referenced as the Son of Man, God says, set your face against somebody called Gog, right? We'll look at who this is in a minute. But set your face against Gog. Then at the end of that verse, it says, prophesy against him. Then verse 3 says, I'm against you, O Gog, this chief prince, this ruler, whoever this is. And you notice all the way through, it's talking to this individual person. Verse 4 says, I will turn you back. I will bring you forth and your army. Verse 6, many people are with you. Get prepared in verse 7. Prepare yourself, you and your company. Unto you, you're going to be a guard to them. And after many days, you will be visited. In the latter years, you will come into the land that's brought back from the sword. So this is a very, very, very personal chapter against an individual. And clearly, this is a ruler of a nation. And we'll get on and see which nation that is, because it says that his chief prince or his chief ruler of these different areas. So it isn't just one person coming down into Israel, but this ruler is directing his army, and in fact, many armies from different nations down to attack Israel. So what we've now got to do is go and find out who this Gog is. And we do that in a couple of different ways. First of all, we can go and look at where the territories are that are mentioned here. So we've got territories like Gog of the land of Magog. So that's first on the list. So you can do some digging about historically. There's this book here called The Empire of the Tsars, and it's written by an historian called Ragozin. And this historian says that Gog, king of Magog, was originally a real and historical person, none other, in fact, than chief of the Scythians, probably a warrior sufficiently renowned to have survived as a byword for terror in later generations. And there's a statue or image of the leader of the Scythians, Gog. By the way, Gog means a mountain when you look it up in the Hebrew. And really, this is somebody that sees himself as somebody that's above everybody else. You know, a mountain is above all of the structures on planet Earth and reaches up into the heavens. And this title of Gog is sort of indicating that this person himself sees himself like a mountain, sees himself as indestructible and mighty and above all other people. So Gog was an historical person. Now, clearly, whoever he was, king of Magog, this is going back thousands of years ago. So this isn't Gog himself. This is a latter day Gog. And what you actually find out is that Gog was a title given to the rulers of Magog in ancient times, a bit like Pharaoh was a title given to the ruler of Egypt. That's basically what this is. It's a title of whoever is ruling the land of Magog. So then you say, well, we better go and find out where Magog is. And this is an ancient map. And it's a map called The World as Known to the Hebrews. And I don't know if you can see there on the right-hand side here, above the Caucasus Mountains in southern Russia here is where it says Magog is. And you can also notice coming across the same area is Scythia. And we read, didn't we, just then that Gog, king of Magog, was also king of the Scythians. So what you can then do is, well, this is what I did. I did some more hunting around and found that another very ancient historian called Josephus also talks about this place called Magog. And there he is, that's Josephus. And in chapter 6 of this book that he wrote, it says, Magog founded those that from him were named the Magogites, but who are by the Greeks called the Scythians. So Josephus, who lived not long after the Lord Jesus Christ, so he's thousands of years ago, as this historian, says that Magog is the same as Scythia, which is exactly what we also read from that other historian. So what you can then do is go onto a map and find out where the Scythians were. Scythia is in that orange area on the screen there. And so what I'm saying to you is that this area called Scythia is in fact the same as Magog. And that whole orange area, or pretty much that entire orange area, is the area that we now call Russia. It's basically southern Russia. But amazingly, I don't know if you can see on the left there, I've superimposed Ukraine, the modern country of Ukraine, over this ancient map showing Scythia. And you notice how Scythia sort of cuts Ukraine entirely in half. So the eastern and southeastern part of Ukraine, of modern day Ukraine, was actually part of Scythia. And we all know that there's been a great war going on between Russia and Ukraine, where Putin is trying to take hold of this part of Ukraine. He tried to take all of Ukraine and failed in doing so. And what he's actually got at the minute, in fact, I can put on the map here what he's actually got at the minute. So this bit in red round here is the BBC's latest map of what Russia has managed to capture of Ukraine. So they haven't got very far into Ukraine, but you notice what they are doing is taking over this sort of last piece of ancient Magog or Scythia. So Magog, I put it to you, is southern Russia and this southeastern part of modern day Ukraine. The other areas that we have read about in Ezekiel chapter 38, verse 2, it said, Son of man, set your face against Gog, who we now know is the king of Magog, of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. And you can do some digging around yourself on this and find that Meshech and Tubal are also references to modern day Russia. So it says in the Schofield Reference Bible, the reference to Meshech and Tubal, Moscow and Tobolsk is a clear mark of identification, Russia and the northern powers. And in another book, The History of Herodotus, it says the Moshi are frequently mentioned in scripture under the name of Meshech. They became known as the Muscoves and gave their name to the old capital of Russia. So I think there's little doubt in my mind that Gog is being described here as the ruler of Russia. Now, if that is the case, of course, we've got a current ruler of Russia, and that current ruler of Russia, who's been in power now exactly 25 years. I mean, how many presidents and prime ministers has he been in power during many, many different reigns? It's quite amazing because Putin came into power on the last day, actually, of the last millennium. So on the 31st of December 1999, Boris Yeltsin stood down and plucked this person from pretty much obscurity and put him as the president of the Russian Federation. And Putin pretty much has been in power, or really has been in power, every day since then. So Putin, of course, at the moment is Gog. And yeah, he could drop down dead tomorrow, and then another Russian ruler would come in and also have the title of Gog. But I've a strong feeling that Putin might actually be the very individual that God has been calling out in Ezekiel 38 for 2,500 years for us to be aware of here in these last days. Have a little look at this.
There is no other world leader like Vladimir Putin. Action man. Man of the people.
Да здравствует Россия!
And ruler of Russia.
Владимир Путин приветствует экипаж морского тральщика.
From Ukraine to Syria, Vladimir Putin's influence is being felt. He's faced countless accusations of corruption, but still has record
approval ratings. Now, is Putin the sort of person that we could possibly imagine one day invading Israel that we've just read about in Ezekiel 38? Is he a man of war? Is he a man of conflict? Is he somebody that would invade other countries and bring the sort of destruction that Ezekiel 38 says he's going to bring? Well, here is another video to look at.
Vladimir Putin uses the same tactics in every war he wages. Understanding what he's done before can help us predict Russia's next moves in Ukraine. This is how Putin fights. Putin's army has been killing civilians for years. Chechnya in 1999, Georgia 2008, Syria, and now Ukraine. Many believe this isn't just collateral damage. These attacks are by design.
It's intentional bombing. They're attacking civilian targets.
It's a tactic designed to drive as many people out of the capital.
I mean, wasn't it only on Sunday, Palm Sunday, that he attacked into
town called
Suny in Ukraine? Hypersonic missile killing many people who were celebrating, Easter at church services. And these are targeted attacks. And that's basically what this is saying. It's absolute, well, it's terror and total aggression, which is why, of course, is being sort of condemned pretty much universally. We know there's some nations that support Putin, but he's become a pariah world leader, hasn't he? Now, one phrase that's puzzled me for a long time, and I'm not saying I've got this right, in verse 4, it says, God here talking to Gog, who is, we know, the Russian ruler, God says, I will turn you back and put hooks in your jaws, and I will bring you forth. And then this great army comes down. And you sort of think to yourself, what does it mean when it says that this Russian leaders turn back only then to be brought forth? I mean, what event is this talking about? It's got to be talking about some event that happens. In other words, there's a turning back and then they come forth, right? So I've puzzled for a long time about this, and I'm going to give you what I think possibly is the answer, right? So I started to think about this because I looked in many versions of the Bible. In fact, I looked at every single solitary English version of the Bible, of Ezekiel chapter 38, and there's probably 40 to 50 different versions in English of Ezekiel 38 that are out there. And the most popular translation of that phrase, I will turn you back, is basically what I've put on the screen there. I will turn you around. So in other words, Russia's going in a direction of travel, and God turns them around from that direction of travel and then brings them down into Israel. So then I thought, well, wait a minute. What direction of travel is Russia currently going on? And it's certainly not heading into Israel, is it? Is heading into the west, traveling east, I suppose, but heading into the west. So there's the map of Ukraine, and you can see, you know, all those red lines is the current direction of Russia, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which is the wrong direction ultimately, because we know that the ultimate direction is south, isn't it, into Israel? That's what Ezekiel 38 says. And what we also know is that Russia has sort of rushed or tried to rush into this direction. In fact, if you remember, they tried to take Kyiv, the capital, and failed to do so, didn't they? Quite dramatically. And what happened was, of course, the West supplied Ukraine with literally billions upon billions upon billions of dollars of weapons and missiles and rockets and armaments and military equipment to enable Ukraine to sort of stop Russia in its tracks. So Russia hasn't really been able to get any much further, and it's sort of stopped where it is. It makes very, very, very minimal progress, a mile here and a mile there, but pretty much it's stationary. Now, what we also know is right now that President Trump is pushing for a peace agreement, isn't he? Yeah. And also, have you seen recently that there's what's called the coalition of the willing? In other words, there's some nations in like Germany and the UK and France and others that are saying we're going to potentially put troops into Ukraine, which will have an impact of really upping the ante, because then Putin, if he launches missiles, suddenly is killing potentially UK, German, French troops, and that then becomes World War III. And so I actually think what could well happen here is that the direction of travel of Russia trying to push this way is stopped, and he is forced to turn round. And I wonder if that's what the turning back is. I mean, there is Russia up here, look, with all its missiles and nuclear weapons. It's got more nuclear weapons than any other country on earth, including America. And I think almost, I mean, that's the current direction of travel, isn't it? Because that's going into Ukraine. And I think there's a wall effectively that's going to be put up. In a sense, it's been put up already, but I think Russia's going to be stopped from going any further into Ukraine. And I think because of that and this turning around, if you like, of Russia, it will free up their forces to then come south. I don't know if that makes sense. So there's a turnaround coming. And if you think about it, if the war in Ukraine was still flat out happening, Russia couldn't come south because it's expending all its energy right now fighting Ukraine. It wouldn't be able to divert another million or so members of its army to go down south while still trying to fight Ukraine. So Ukraine war has got to come to some negotiated standoff, but Russia is going to get very, very raged about that pushing back. And I think that's one of the reasons why they come down into the south. And we'll look at how we will do that in a minute. But Russia doesn't come alone, okay? So where it's got Gog of the land of Magog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, that's talking about Russia. But there's a whole bunch of other nations coming with Russia. So verse 5 and verse 6 tell us who those nations are. First on the list is Persia, then Ethiopia and Libya, Gomer, and the house of Togarmah of the north quarters and all his troops and many people with you. So these are the nations that God says are going to join Russia in coming down. So I'm just going to quickly put those nations on the map so you can see where they are. So there's Magog, Meshech and Tubal at the top there, which covers majority of Russia. Togarmah and Gomer, I think, is predominantly talking about Turkey and Armenia and Georgia area. Persia, that was first on the list, we've already said, is Iran. Libya, I think, actually is Libya, but could extend towards Algeria as well. And Ethiopia, we recognize the name Ethiopia, but I actually think it's more, if you look at the ancient area of Ethiopia, is pretty much more modern day Sudan than Ethiopia. And that's quite significant, as we'll see in a minute. And it's also interesting to note that none of the nations nearby, are mentioned in Ezekiel 38. In other words, none of them actually touch Israel. And we'll touch on that in just a minute. So this is like an outer circle of nations that are pouring into Israel. We'll have a look at that in just a minute. But first up, let's just have a think what we're being told here, because it says, of course, that these are the nations that are going to come with Russia. So you might well expect Iran and Turkey and Libya and Ethiopia to all be on side with Russia. Because if they're going to join forces with Russia, they're going to be on side with Russia. So one of the things that we've been looking for years is for Iran to be allied with Russia, for Turkey to be allied with Russia, Libya and Sudan to be allied with Russia. So let's have a look at a couple of videos in that regard. So first up, I think, is Iran.
One country had stepped up above all the others to begin supplying the Russian war machine with much of the equipment it needs to continue staying in the fight: Iran. As the winter season of 2022-23 set in, hundreds of Iranian-manufactured kamikaze drones known as the Shahed 136 suddenly began appearing across the battlefield in Ukraine under Russian service. The Russians would go on to use swarms of these relatively inexpensive Iranian-made drones to help bombard Ukrainian civilian infrastructure into rubble by overwhelming their air defenses with sheer numbers. A tactic which eventually contributed to roughly half of the Ukrainian electric grid getting knocked offline in a deliberate campaign of terror. But it's not just the drones that the Iranians are actively sending to assist the Russians either. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, better known as the IRGC, is the unconventional, asymmetric, and ideological military wing of the Iranian armed forces. And by the end of 2022, they had deployed many of their own military advisors and soldiers on the ground within the Russian-occupied sections of Ukraine. And in addition to the hundreds of kamikaze drones, the Iranians have also been providing the Russians with much-needed ammunition, artillery shells, ballistic missiles, and body armor to help keep their inventory stable and to help keep them fighting on for longer. The Iranian regime has gone all in on militarily supporting the Russian side during the invasion of Ukraine, in much the same way that the Americans and Europeans are actively supporting the Ukrainian side. But the growing cooperation between Moscow and Tehran extends far beyond the borders of Ukraine, and the world may just be witnessing the birth of a full-blown Russian-Iranian military alliance that could define the 21st century in the region.
So that's quite interesting. Now, that was about 18 months ago that this guy produced that video. On the 17th of January this year, Russia and Iran made a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement, all to do with military alliance. Have a look at this.
Iran and Russia are expected to sign a major new strategic partnership treaty during a visit to Moscow by Iran's president. Masoud Pezeshkian arrived in the Russian capital earlier on Friday. He's meeting now with President Putin before signing the deal. Little's known about the upcoming treaty, but both sides are looking to deepen their relations in the face of Western sanctions.
So everything seems to be coming together in terms of Iran and Russia being allied, both pariah states really in the world, but both of them coming together. Now, another nation that we've already talked about is Libya. So has Russia got anything to do with Libya? Because that seems quite a strange connection. But when Assad fell from power at the back end of 2024, very suddenly, Russia's base in Tartessus became very, very tenuous at that point in time. So Russia started to look at setting up another base. And one of the areas that it looked at setting up and is still looking at is Libya. Have a look at this.
Russia says it is in talks with the new rulers of Syria. They're trying to work out a deal to keep the bases operational. But it's not a done deal yet. And they're working on a backup plan in case they're forced to abandon the Syrian bases. The Russians have started moving out some equipment. There are satellite images of the action. They show Antonov AN-124s being loaded. These are the world's largest cargo planes. They're being packed with Russian equipment and being flown back to Russia. These planes are also carrying diplomats from Russia and also from allied countries like Belarus and North Korea. But not all the cargo planes were headed home. Some of them took a different route. They landed up in the North African nation of Libya. 2 aircraft were spotted making trips to a Libyan airbase. These are the Ilyushin 76TD. These aircraft landed in the Al Khadim base near the city of Benghazi. These planes were presumably carrying Russian military equipment, which raises the question, is Russia relocating its military assets? Is it shifting base from Syria to Libya? And why Libya? Let's look at the situation in Libya first. It's a mess. This country has been in crisis for more than a decade, since 2011, in fact, when its leader and dictator Muammar Gaddafi was assassinated. Libya has been...
Right, so there's a lot more to that video, but you can see suddenly that Russia has got its tentacles into Libya. Now, what was the other place in Northern Africa? Ethiopia, or I believe it's actually Sudan is more likely to be the area. Have a look at this. This is now Russia and Sudan.
Our next story also involves Russia, but this time the theatre is different. It is not about Ukraine or the US. Moscow has other fish to fry too. It has set its sights on the African nation of Sudan. Russia has worked out an agreement to set up a naval base in Sudan on the coast of the Red Sea. This would be Russia's first naval base in Africa. Let's turn to the map. This is Sudan. As you can see, it has a coast along the Red Sea. This is where Russia plans to set up a naval base, and yesterday Sudan gave it the go-ahead.
So that's really interesting, isn't it? Everything is coming together. And a lot of this has happened with the fall of Assad, who was a major supporter of Putin, and Putin majorly backed him. And it's a whole other story to understand why Assad fell overnight. We haven't got time to go into that. But what we can see is that the nations are lining up exactly as God said that they would. Another group of some nations that we haven't considered yet are in verse 6, which is Gomer and all his troops and the house of Togarmah. So I looked up where Gomer and Togarmah were when Ezekiel wrote. Wikipedia tells you about Gomer, and it says the Hebrew name Gomer refers to the Cimmerians, is it? I don't know how you could say that, but anyway, let's call it Cimmerians, who dwelt in what is now southern Russia and beyond into the Caucasus region, including countries of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Josephus, that we've already mentioned, that ancient historian living at around about the time of Jesus, wrote, he says that he placed Gomer and the Gomerites in the Anatolian Galatia, which is eastern Turkey, and he placed Togarmah as the father of the Phrygians, which is western Turkey. So when you put Togarmah and Gomer together, I think it looks a little bit like this. So there's a map of this area, and in the dark area that I've put on the screen there now is where I think Togarmah and Gomer are. Now, it does say that there's many other people with them as well, so maybe there are some other nations, but clearly God has named these as being the major driving force. Now, the reason that Turkey is very, very unusual, really, is because, of course, Turkey is in NATO. Yes. And NATO, of course, is the opposing force to Russia. So how on earth is it that Turkey can be allied with Russia, but is currently in NATO? Well, have a look at this.
Well, another leader making the trip to Russia for the BRICS summit is Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. His country is seeking to become the first NATO member to join the BRICS club, which likes to see itself as a counterweight to the West. DW correspondent Yulia Han has more on Turkey's ambitions.
Turkish President Erdogan is trying to forge new ties beyond his traditional Western allies. For some time now, he has shown interest in joining BRICS. The bloc led by Russia and China includes some of the largest emerging economies and views itself as a counterweight to the Western-led global order.
Turkey cannot achieve its goals only by turning towards the West. Turkey can become a strong, prosperous, prestigious, and effective country if it develops its relations with the West and East simultaneously.
So Turkey is definitely looking towards Russia as well, and actually is far more like Russia in terms of its autocracy and the way it operates. I actually think there's a very high possibility, because of Trump saying that he's going to back out of NATO and not support NATO in the same way, that NATO could ultimately collapse, and then Turkey will just drop straight into the arms of Putin and Russia. At that point, we wait to see what happens there. Verse 7 says, still talking, God talking to the Russian leader Gog, he says, get prepared. Prepare for yourself, you and all your company, all this array of nations that are assembled unto you, and be a guard unto them. It literally means protect them. I don't know what you think, but I think Russia's definitely been preparing for conflict. Have a look at this.
We will continue to equip our strategic forces with the latest types of weapons.
Putin also pledged to modernize the military, and yesterday stopped to survey Moscow's newest weapons, including surveillance drones. Russia plans a 30% expansion of its armed forces and wants to form new and bigger units.
So Russia has been upgrading its armed forces and military since early 2000, maybe 2005. And that's why it's gone hyper aggressive, because it's got a huge amount of military upgraded equipment, and it's got something like 2 million reservists in the army. So, you know, they keep talking about the enormous losses of soldiers. Yeah. They just keep calling up another 160. I think there was 160,000 called up just the other day. Yeah. There's just an enormous supply of young men, basically, to throw into conflict, and he doesn't care about, you know, I think there's been over 500,000 men either killed or injured that are Russian in the Ukrainian conflict. It's staggering numbers, but Putin doesn't care about, he doesn't bat an eyelid, absolutely. Now here's when it gets interesting as well, because in verse 8 of Ezekiel 38 it says, in the latter years, you will come into the land that's brought back from the sword, gathered out of many people against the mountains of Israel that have always been waste, but is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. Now, this is what puts us post-1948, basically, because Israel did not exist as a nation, did it? All the way from AD 70 up to 1948. And if you notice there, it says that you're going to come against a land where the people have been gathered, that have been gathered out of many people. That's the gathering of the Jews in 1948 back into the land. So wherever this prophecy lands, it's got to be post-1948. It can't be before, because Israel wasn't in the land at that point. The other interesting thing is it says, you'll come into the land that's brought back from the sword. But modern versions don't put it like that. It says, you're going to come into the land that is recovering from war, which is why it says at the end, look, they're going to be dwelling safely or confidently, right? So there's a war that Israel's recovering from when Russia comes down. Yeah. And at that point, they're dwelling safely and confidently. So the question is, which war is Israel recovering from when Russia comes down? Which war are they recovering from that then has given them more a higher degree of confidence? And the answer to that question, I think, is the current one. It's what I call the inner ring war that Israel is currently fighting against all the nearby nations. So, you know, we looked at the outer ring of the outer circle of nations that come in led by Russia. Not one of them bordered Israel. That's because the inner ring war has already taken place, and Israel has defeated those enemies that are nearby. And they're all listed there because Psalm 83 tells us about all the nearby people that make war against Israel. But have a listen to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who is talking about this.
Since the horrendous October 7th attack, we've been fighting our common enemies and changing the face of the Middle East. On that infamous day, Hamas monsters savagely murdered 1,200 innocent people, including more than 40 Americans. They beheaded men, they raped women, they burnt babies alive, and they took 251 people hostage to the dungeons of Gaza. And after this worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust, Iran and its henchmen in the Middle East were absolutely ecstatic. Haniya praised the massacre. Sinwar said that Israel was finished. Nasrallah boasted that Israel was, here's what he said, as feeble as a spider's web. Well, Mr. President, Haniya is gone. Sinwar is gone. Nasrallah is gone. We've devastated Hamas. We decimated Hezbollah. We destroyed Assad's remaining armaments. And we crippled Iran's air defenses.
So I think the inner ring war is sort of underway. So what I'm sort of suggesting is that there's this inner ring war here that is underway right now, but then this sort of outer circle group of nations led by Russia end up coming in to the void that is left. And we might ask why that is. Why on earth is it, if there is some temporary peace in Israel, why on earth would Russia come down into this sort of semi-peaceful situation? Well, God tells us. In verse 10 of Ezekiel 38, it says, "Thus saith the Lord God, it's going to come to pass that at the same time," so when Israel's dwelling confidently, recovering from war, "that at the same time shall things come into your mind, and you're going to think an evil thought." This is talking about the Russian leaders' mindset. Verse 11 says, "And you're going to say, I'm going to go up to the land of unwalled villages. I'm going to go to those that are at rest and dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls and having neither bars nor gates, to take a spoil and to take a prey, to turn thine hand upon the desolate places that are now inhabited, and upon the people that are gathered out of the nations, which have got cattle and goods and dwell in the midst of the land." So I think this is talking about the mind of this man. And I think what we're being told is that he is going to think an evil thought at some point, and he's going to say in his mind, I'm going to go up to the land of unwalled villages to Israel to take a spoil and to take a prey. But this, remember, is after he's been turned back. This is how you can't push into the West anymore. And in a rage, he decides to come down into Israel. But he comes, you notice, to take a spoil. And the question I grew up thinking about, because I remember going to many, many Bible talks as a kid growing up in Birmingham and hearing many speakers say, well, what is this spoil? Well, maybe one day Israel might find oil. And maybe that's what is right. Well, in the year 2014, so just about 10 or 11 years ago, Israel announced the discovery of an offshore gas field, which they called the Leviathan. And it was one of the largest gas and oil finds in modern years in the entire world. And suddenly Israel was able to become an energy exporter. And well, it's developed and developed since then to this point. Let me just show you this video.
Israel, Egypt, and the European Union have signed a natural gas export deal on Wednesday during a regional energy conference in Cairo. The deal will, for the first time, allow significant exports of Israeli gas to Europe, according to the Israeli Ministry of Energy. Officials have said that they expect the Israeli gas will be sent to liquefaction plants in Egypt and then shipped north to the European market. Minister of Energy Karine El-Harar said this is a great moment in which tiny Israel turns into a significant player in the global energy market. President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, addressed the importance of the agreement in light of Europe's search for alternatives to its historic reliance on Russian oil and gas.
So this is hugely significant. If you imagine, Europe now has shut off the gas supplies almost entirely from Russia. Israel steps in and says, oh, we've got some gas we can supply to you through Egypt back into Europe. This has probably wound Putin up. So he's probably looking at Israel as taking his own energy, currency and cash and thinking to himself, well, actually, if I take over Israel, I'm actually then controlling all those gas supplies. Then where's Europe going to go? They've got no choice. They're going to have to buy it from me. So I think absolutely this could be the spoil that Putin wants and actually probably needs as well, because Russia doesn't make things really. Who buys anything made in Russia? Like nobody. What they do is use their energy supplies. That's the vast bulk of their GDP. So I'm pretty certain this is coming into place. Now, the last bit to sort of say in relation to Ezekiel 38 is that there is an opposing force to Russia. Now, the opposing force to Russia is in Ezekiel chapter 38, verse 13, and it says, Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish with all the young lions thereof shall say to you, Gog, have you come to take a spoil? Have you gathered your company to take a prey, to carry away silver and gold, to take away cattle and goods, to take a great spoil? So these are a bunch of nations that are saying, what are you doing? You know, what on earth is happening? It doesn't sound like they can stop it happening. It's like they're on the sidelines saying, what on earth is going on? So now, quickly, I'm going to decode Sheba and Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish and the young lions. I'm going to show you who this opposing force actually is. So first on the list are Sheba and Dedan. So you go to maps to look where Sheba and Dedan are, and there they are. Look on that map there. And they are pretty much the area that we now know as Saudi Arabia, and also the Gulf Arab states like Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, countries like that. All right. So that is part of the opposing force. That sort of makes sense because Saudi Arabia is arch enemies of Iran, and Iran is allied to Russia. So it sort of makes sense that Saudi Arabia, Sunni Muslim, are on the opposite side of the fence to Iran, Shia Muslim, who's allied to Russia, if that makes sense. But the next on the list is, who was next on the list? Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish. Now, I think the clue as to who Tarshish is in Ezekiel chapter 27, verse 12, because it says there that Tarshish did business with the Phoenicians because of your great wealth of goods. They exchanged silver, iron, tin, and lead for your merchandise. So in other words, these ancient people called the Phoenicians traded with a place called Tarshish for these metals, silver, iron, tin, and lead. Now, out of that list of metals, tin is the rarest, right? Out of all of the list that's there, tin was extremely rare in the ancient times, because bearing in mind, we're going back to the days of Ezekiel, which is 600 BC, 2,600 years ago. So the question is, and it says there, look, what country did the Phoenicians sail to go and get tin? Well, have a listen to this.
One of the key materials they sought was tin, which was essential for making bronze, a strong and versatile alloy. To find this valuable metal, the Phoenicians ventured far beyond their homeland in the Levant. They sailed to the British Isles, a region that was quite distant from their main trading hubs. The British Isles, particularly the area known as Cornwall, were rich in tin deposits. The Phoenicians discovered these tin deposits through their own exploration and maintained the knowledge of these mines as a closely guarded secret.
So Tarshish is Britain. In fact, it's likely derived from a Phoenician word that means smelting place, which is interesting. In fact, Her Majesty's stationery office publication on mining says the principal economic minerals in southwest England are silver, iron, tin, and lead. We went down to Marazion a number of times on holiday, and I actually picked this up. This is one of those little brochures you get, little leaflets that are lying around. And I picked it up and I was reading about it. There's St. Michael's Mount. And lo and behold, on the second page there, I know it's a bit blurred. This is taken a few years ago on an ancient camera, but it says in ancient times, the Phoenicians traded for tin and copper here. So even the local, tourist brochure says that the Phoenicians came here and traded for tin and copper. The other thing is, of course, that Britain historically has been known as the Old Lion. I mean, if you go into right outside Buckingham Palace, there's a huge lion statue there. There's lions all over the place when you look for them in London. And I think that gives us a clue that Britain is known as the Old Lion. And, it's said that Tarshish and the young lions.
Yes.
And I think that the young lions are the offspring nations of this country. In other words, other English-speaking nations. Some also include India in that list as well. I'm not sure about India, but certainly Canada, the USA, Australia, and New Zealand are all classed as the young lions. And in the First World War, there was a poster saying the empire needs men. And it says there, all answer the call, helped by the young lions, the old lion defies his foes, enlist now. And it's amazing, really, isn't it? It's like a biblical prophecy there as a poster, which is just amazing. Now, you might actually say, well, hold on, this is a right mixed bag of broken biscuits here, because we've got Sheba and Edom, which is Saudi Arabia, then we've got Britain, then we've got America, New Zealand, and so on, and Australia and Canada. Why has God gathered those nations together as the opposing force? What on earth has Britain and America got to do with Saudi Arabia? Well, actually, quite a lot, because I've just put on the map there the bases that Britain and America have got in Saudi Arabia. And you might say, why on earth, of all places, why have we, and why have America especially, got so many bases in Saudi Arabia? And the answer is on this video.
The U.S. maintains dozens of bases across Oman, the UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Iraq. 7 of the 8 countries around the Gulf, save for Iran. This includes an Air Force base in Qatar and the United States 5th Fleet being further headquartered within Bahrain, which is generally composed of more than 15,000 sailors, 2 aircraft carriers, dozens of other vessels, and between them and the Air Force base, countless aircraft. As the current largest single source for all of humanity's energy, all of this presence in the area from the United States is generally in place to ensure that the oil continues flowing, and to counter Iran's influence over.
So there you go. God has actually said Sheba and Dedan, Tarshish and the young lions are coming together as an opposing force. And lo and behold, in these last days, that's exactly what's happening. In fact, of course, you remember President Trump a few years ago when he was last in power, put something in place called the Abraham Accords. And the Abraham Accords were with Gulf Arab nations especially. And in this current term in office, he said he wants Saudi Arabia to become part of the Abraham Accords that he is putting together. Have a look at this. So just as Russia's coming together with all of its nations, Saudi Arabia and Britain and America are also coming together as the opposing force. But what was the question that was asked by this power that's opposing Russia? Have you come to take a spoil? You can even hear Trump maybe even saying those words, because to him it's all about the deal. Yeah. It's all about the money. Is this what have you betrayed me? Is it just for money? Is it for a deal? Is it for spoil? As it turns out, that's exactly what it is, because Putin, we're told, does come to take a spoil. Now, how does it all end? I've just got 2 slides to go. This is how it ends. It ends in utter catastrophe for Russia and all of its invading army, because God says in verse 18, it's going to come to pass at the same time when Gog comes against the land of Israel, saith the Lord God, that my fury shall come up in my face. For in my jealousy and in the fire of my wrath have I spoken. Surely in that day there shall be a great shaking in the land of Israel, so that the fish of the sea and the fowls of heaven and the beasts of the field and all creeping things that creep upon the earth and all the men that are upon the face of the earth are going to shake at my presence, and the mountains will be thrown down, the steep places will fall, and every wall shall fall to the ground. And I'll call for a sword against him throughout all my mountains, says the Lord God, and every man's sword will be against his brother. And I'll plead against him with pestilence and with blood, and I'll rain upon him. This is Gog, the Russian leader, and upon all his bands and troops, and upon many people that are with him, an overflowing rain and great hailstones, fire and brimstone. Thus will I magnify myself and sanctify myself, and I'll be known in the eyes of many nations, and they shall know that I am the Lord. And the destruction that will pour upon Gog will be the likes of, I think, this type of event that we didn't see, but happened in the days of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's literally fire, hailstones, and burning sulfur coming down from God. So Russia is going to fall on the mountains of Israel. And really, that's the end of that chapter. That's the very last verse, really. And you might say, why do we really care about all this destruction that's coming and Russia coming to an end? And the reason is because of this last slide. Because Ezekiel 39, the next chapter, says, I will make known my holy name among my people of Israel. I will not let anyone bring shame on it. And the nations too will know that I am the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. That day of judgment will come, says the sovereign Lord. Everything will happen just as I have declared it. So in other words, the destruction of the Russian armies and all of its armies that come against Israel is to do with the day of judgment. It's the day of Armageddon. It's the day when God intervenes in the affairs of this world and establishes his kingdom. And in Acts chapter 17, talking about the day of judgment, it says that God has set a day for judging the world with justice by the man who he has appointed, and he proved to everyone who this is by raising him from the dead. It's Jesus. So really what we're looking at with Ezekiel 38 is the prelude to the return of Jesus. Jesus is going to come back probably before Russia invades, actually. But at the point when Russia is destroyed is the time when Jesus himself establishes himself as the righteous ruler, the wicked and corrupt rulership of Russia, and in fact of all nations has been wiped away to be replaced by the glorious kingdom of God ruled over by God's Son, the Lord Jesus. And that's why I think God's told us so much about these events that are leading up to this time. Thank you for listening.